The truth about Irish slavery, unraveling a myth of chains and confusion. Introduction, viral lies and deep roots. In an age where social media distills centuries of history into bite-sized memes, few narratives have proved as persistent or as misleading as the idea that the Irish were once slaves just like Africans. Often accompanied by grainy woodcut images and emotionally provocative headlines like "The Irish, the forgotten white slaves," or "They were white and they were slaves," the claim circulates with a vengeance every time America confronts the legacy of slavery and racism. But here's the truth. The Irish were never enslaved in the same way that Africans were during the transatlantic slave trade. This is not a matter of political correctness. It is a matter of rigorous historical evidence, primary documentation, and the sober conclusions of hundreds of scholars across disciplines. That doesn't mean Irish history was easy or just. Far from it. The Irish were colonized, oppressed, deported, and treated with astonishing cruelty, especially under English rule in the 17th century. But to conflate that brutal experience with African chattel slavery is not only incorrect, it is intellectually dishonest and politically dangerous. Ireland in the 17th century: war, rebellion, and deportation. To understand how this myth arose, we must first revisit the turbulent 17th century. Ireland at the time was a nation under siege, economically, religiously, and militarily. The island was largely Catholic, ruled by an English crown determined to impose Protestantism and central authority. Tensions exploded during the Irish Rebellion of 1641, followed by Oliver Cromwell's invasion in 1649, a campaign marked by massacres, mass displacement, and widespread land confiscation. In Cromwell's own words, "The Irish were enemies to be broken. I am persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches," he wrote after the massacre at Drogheda. As English forces consolidated control, they began deporting tens of thousands of Irish people, rebels, civilians, and even children, to the colonies, particularly to Barbados, Jamaica, Montserrat, and Virginia. Contemporary accounts, including those in parliamentary archives, describe how these prisoners were sold or assigned to colonial masters for periods of hard labor. They were shackled, branded, and crammed into ships under inhuman conditions. In some cases, children as young as 10 were removed from their families and sent to tropical plantations. It's little wonder, then, that some historians have described these deportees as existing in de facto slavery. The term is emotionally compelling, but legally and structurally, their condition remained distinct from chattel slavery. 2. Indentured servitude, a system of exploitation, not slavery. The vast majority of Irish people sent to the colonies during this period were indentured servants, not slaves. An indenture was a contract, often coerced, sometimes voluntary, in which a person agreed to work without wages for a period of 4 to 10 years, typically in exchange for passage to the Americas, food, shelter, or repayment of a fine or sentence. Indentured servitude was widespread across early British America and applied to many groups: English debtors, Scottish prisoners, German immigrants, Irish civilians. Even some Africans before racialized slavery laws hardened. The conditions were often hellish. Labor was grueling, especially on sugar plantations. Many died of exhaustion, malnutrition, or tropical disease. Women were vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Colonial laws allowed for whipping, branding, and contract extensions for misbehavior or escape attempts. But despite these horrors, indentured servants retained some legal personhood, and crucially, their status was temporary. Their contracts had end dates, their children were born free, they were not legally considered property. In contrast, African chattel slavery was hereditary, perpetual, racially codified, and brutally dehumanizing. Slaves were legally owned, bought and sold like livestock, and denied any basic rights. Children born to enslaved women automatically inherited slave status. This distinction is not academic hair-splitting. It is foundational to how race, law, and labor developed in the Atlantic world. 3. The Irish in the Caribbean. The case of Barbados. The myth of Irish slavery often invokes Barbados, where many Irish indentured servants were indeed sent after Cromwell's campaigns. The island became a booming sugar colony in the mid-1600s and relied on a vast labor force. Irish laborers worked alongside and eventually were displaced by African slaves. In the early decades, Irish indentured servants made up a substantial portion of the labor population. However, as the sugar economy intensified, planters increasingly turned to African slave labor, which they found more profitable due to its permanence. African slaves outnumbered white servants on the island by more than 5 to 1. Laws were passed that created separate caste systems for black slaves and white workers. Irish servants, once their terms ended, were usually released, whereas African slaves remained permanently enslaved. Barbadian laws explicitly differentiated between servants, white Europeans, and slaves, Africans. In 1661, the Barbados Slave Code became the first comprehensive legislation institutionalizing chattel slavery. It offered no protections for slaves, but required minimum standards for servants. To suggest that the Irish in Barbados were slaves, in the same sense as Africans, is to ignore the legal, economic, and social frameworks that governed both groups. Of the fabrication of a myth, who spread the story? The modern myth of Irish slavery didn't come from historians. It came from propagandists, white supremacists, and pseudo-historians. One of the earliest and most influential sources is Michael A. Hoffman, The Sect, a conspiracy theorist and Holocaust denier. His 1993 book, They Were White and They Were Slaves, mixed fact with fabrication, selectively quoting sources and implying that white servitude was worse than black slavery. The book gained traction among fringe communities but was rejected by every serious academic historian. From there, the myth evolved online. In 2000, an article titled "The Irish Slaves: What They Will Never Tell You in History Class" went viral, filled with fake quotes, false numbers, and emotional manipulation. Social media memes emerged showing white figures in chains, often accompanied by phrases like 400,000 Irish slaves ignored by history. Far-right websites like Stormfront and Reddit forums began using the myth to counter discussions of racial inequality, reparations, or police violence. Crucially, no reputable historian supports the Irish slavery narrative. The Journal of Social History, Slate, The Guardian, and numerous Irish and American scholars have published extensive rebuttals. Irish historians respond. Irish scholars themselves have been at the forefront of debunking the myth. Historian Liam Hogan, based in Limerick, has spent years researching original documents, court records, and transportation lists from the 1600s. His verdict is unambiguous. There is no evidence that the Irish were ever subjected to hereditary, race-based chattel slavery. Any suggestion otherwise is a gross distortion. Hogan's work, published in the Irish Times and on academic forums, exposes how 17th century sources are routinely cherry-picked or misquoted. For instance, a 1625 record referring to Irish slaves was using a generic term for captured rebels, not legal slaves. Many supposed slave ship manifests are fabricated or taken out of context. His central point, words like slave, were sometimes used colloquially or rhetorically, but the law and economy clearly distinguished between servants and slaves. Other Irish historians, including Patrick Walsh and Cormac O'Brien, have affirmed these findings. In fact, Ireland itself never had legal slavery after the Middle Ages. The last vestiges of Irish slavery disappeared in the 12th century. This, race, class, and misappropriated pain. The myth of Irish slavery serves a particular political function. It is often invoked as a way to deflect from America's legacy of racial injustice, suggest that white people suffered too, argue against reparations or affirmative action, assert a colorblind version of history. This logic is deeply flawed. Yes, the Irish were colonized and discriminated against. They were stereotyped in British media, excluded from political power, and subjected to famine. In America, Irish immigrants were mocked with signs like "No Irish Need Apply" and depicted in cartoons as ape-like brutes. But by the late 19th century, Irish Americans had largely integrated into the white American mainstream. They gained political power, especially in cities, intermarried, and benefited from white privilege, unavailable to black Americans trapped in a system of segregation, redlining, and disenfranchisement. To appropriate the language of slavery to describe Irish suffering is to flatten historical complexity, erase black suffering, and inject confusion into necessary conversations about race and justice. Sept, memory, myth, and the danger of distortion. All societies construct myths, stories that simplify history to create identity. For Irish Americans, the myth of oppression is powerful. It connects them to real trauma and struggle. But when that myth morphs into false equivalence, it becomes dangerous. Myths matter. When we believe that all oppression is the same, we lose the ability to recognize systemic injustice. When we say the Irish were slaves too, we dismiss the very real differences between a servant who earned freedom and a slave whose children were born in chains. As the historian David Olusoga writes, we can't undo the horrors of slavery, but we can stop rewriting history to suit modern prejudices. Conclusion: truth is not a competition. History is not a competition of suffering. The Irish were brutalized and deported. The Africans were enslaved and dehumanized. Both deserve remembrance, but not conflation. In honoring the truth of the past, we build a more just and honest present. Recognizing the unique horror of African chattel slavery does not dishonor the Irish, it simply respects the facts. The best way to honor our ancestors is not by distorting their pain for internet arguments, but by telling the story as it really was: complex, tragic, and human. Sources and suggested reading: Liam Hogan, The Irish Slaves Myth, Irish Times, 2015 to 2020. Don Jordan and Michael Walsh, White Cargo, The Forgotten History of Britain's White Slaves in America. David Bryan Davis, Inhuman Bondage, The Rise and Fall of Slavery in the New World. The Barbados Slave Code, 1661. Michael Guasco, Slaves and Englishmen, Human Bondage in the Early Modern Atlantic World. Patrick Walsh, The South Sea Bubble and Irish Slavery Rhetoric.